So one of the last primitive types that we're going to talk about here is a Boolean. And these are all called primitive types because they essentially are not objects, right? They can only hold per se one type, and you can't really change them as you would an object, which we'll talk about later. All right. So we talked about, of course, the int. We talked about long. We talked about byte, short, float, and double, strings, and a char. So at this point, you are ready to be very dangerous in programming in Java. There's so many things you can do. Nevertheless, there is another type that is equally important called Boolean. So in programming, we are talking about states, right? So true or false. You probably have heard that, ones and zeros and so forth. So Boolean is a type that can only hold one value at certain times. So Boolean can either be true or false, or in this case, 1 or 0. So Boolean is true or false, or 1 to true and 0 for false. That's all, right? So when would we use a Boolean? Well, there's a lot of different cases where we would use a Boolean, as we will see in later videos when we talk about if statements and so forth. So Boolean in this case will allow us to create some sort of a ramification, a tree of statements, right? So you can say, if this is true, then I want this to run. If that's not true, then this should run. So it's more or less black and white. So how do we create a Boolean variable? Well, we say Boolean as such, and again say is true as a name. And you see here the naming is very interesting because whenever we create a Boolean, we tend to use it as a question. So it's usually is something, right? It's true, it's false, or is ready, is killed, is live, or whatever it is, right? So this, it's not mandatory, but it gives the programmer and others who are going to be reading the code that this is indeed a Boolean. So I'm going to say Boolean is true as such. Now the beauty here, if I say print, in fact, let's use this print that we have already here. I'm going to put it below here so we can actually run this. And I'm going to say Boolean, or in this case is true, I should say, the variable. Save this and let's run and see what's going to happen. Well, of course, we have a problem here because we haven't assigned it anything, right? So we have to assign something. Now we can't go ahead and assign something like this because this makes no sense. Boolean is a type and this is a string that we're assigning. So that makes no sense. So we can go ahead and say true, or we can say false as such, right? If I save this and give it a quick run, obviously we should see that it's going to say my name is false. Why? Because we say is true is false. Okay. But also notice the other thing important about initializing variables is that we don't have to initialize all in one line. We could have said this goes for any other variable type that we created, right? We could have just created is true, the variable, and then at some point say is true and added a value of true as such or false, right? So this also works. Save this and run again. We should see this time true, as you can see there. All right, very good. So Boolean is either true or false, or 1 or 0 internally, and it's very useful because it allows us to create statements that have different sections, right? We can say this runs when this is true, when this condition is true, and stop if this condition is met, and so forth. So we will see more of Boolean, obviously, once we learn more about Java and we start talking about if statements and for loops and other great stuff about this language. Very good. So you've learned all of the types, at least the most important primitive types, Boolean. We learned char, characters, strings, floats, and doubles. And remember the distinction between these two, short, byte, long, and integer. You're ready now to be very dangerous with what we've learned so far. So what I want you to do is to play around with this concept, as I always say, right? So you can concatenate all of those and try to figure out the limits for each of these type. Like we said, byte, short, and floats and doubles and so forth. Okay, very good. And I'll see you next.